This week's Torah portion is Parshas Vayelech. We are coming up to Shabbos Shuvah, which is the Shabbos of returning to God Almighty between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We'll have Yom Kippur coming up next week. There's so much to focus on, so much, but the main point is the opportunity to realize, like it says in this week's Parshas Vayelech. It says in Deuteronomy 31, chapter 31, verse 8, it says that God Almighty is with Joshua, that Moses, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, is reminding him that he should not be afraid, that he needs to know that God Almighty is going to walk before him and is going to be with him and is not going to in any way let go of him or let him slip from his grip with the loving embrace that God Almighty holds each one of us. He's not going to abandon him. He should not be afraid. He should not be distressed. He should not be terrified. That's really the lesson for all of us, to know that God Almighty is with us. And even though we might be seeing that when we're reflecting on last year, or when we're taking on this year, we have to go into new territory, uncharted territory, and we might be saying to ourselves, wow, that looks really like a lot. Is that going to be unsurmountable? And we have to say, no, I'm not going to make those calculations. I'm just going to go do the right thing and know that God Almighty is with me. And we see the power of this return to God Almighty is really a power of knowing that God was with us all the time. We just were oblivious to his presence, innocently oblivious for a few moments. And now we could return to recognizing that he's with us. And when we know that he's with us, then we know that his loving kindness is completely bringing us into existence at every instant. And that's really the point of knowing that there's only God Almighty and there's nothing besides God Almighty. The ability to know that there's nothing besides God Almighty is so that we should then feel his massive, completely unlimited loving kindness for us and all creation in a way that is actually without any strings attached. It's completely unconditional. And that feeling, that knowing propels us into even greater response of love towards God Almighty, and then love for every other human being to want to bring them to know God Almighty. We see this clearly established in the mitzvahs of Sefer Mitzvahs, the Rambam's listing the mitzvahs, the first being belief in God, the second being unity of God, which brings us to be able to experience the feeling of being loved by God. And the third, which is the love of God, our reciprocal love of God Almighty, which is then reflected and evidenced by our interest and the power and the energy which we devote to bring other human beings to know God Almighty. So this Shabbos Shuvah is an opportunity to return to that responsibility. And we see, like we said yesterday in the Slichus of Tzom Gedalia, for the fast of commemorating the assassination of the Jewish governor of the Holy Land under the Babylonians, Gedalia, we see that it says over here that referring to the great degree to which God Almighty accepts people returning to him and brings the example of the non-Jewish people, the great city of Nineveh, that their tongues were sharpened like arrows with blasphemy. That's how depraved they were. Their errors and wanton evil grew to on high. When then you, God Almighty, afforded a vision of their overthrow, they were seized by terror and trembling. They did tshuva properly and was accepted before your throne of glory. This is the power of returning to God, that when people wake up, realize what they're thinking and what their speech and action are leading to, they will wake up, and we cannot write them off. It's forbidden for us to write them off and say that they're beyond hope or any redemption, or those people are like that. Our responsibility is to say, well, these people have the opportunity and the potential of returning to God Almighty, and we need to foster that and prompt that. And that's why the central focal point at the highest moment in the afternoon of Yom Kippur is the reading of the book of Jonah, to remind us that, as God Almighty says, he's created all these human beings for a purpose, and it distresses him greatly that their conduct is not in keeping with their purpose and with his vision. And it's our job to go and bring this information to them, to bring this understanding and to bring this knowing and to bring this feeling to their awareness, that they will then feel the love of God Almighty, and they will then themselves love God, and they will then recognize his oneness, and they will then serve God as every human being will, as we prepare for the coming of Mashiach, when all human beings are going to come to serve God Almighty. So this is our particular opportunity during these 10 days of returning to God Almighty between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is to strengthen our effort to bring ourselves to recognize God, to feel God's love, and to love God Almighty and our fellows and bring everyone else to that. This is the tremendous opportunity we have in these moments of time. And that pulling everyone together really for this, to hear the message of God Almighty, is the message of this week's Torah portion, the Hakel. We are now in the 8th year of the sabbatical cycle. We just concluded the Shemitah year, and now is the Hakel year. It's the concept of bringing everyone together. And when the Jewish people came together in the times of the Holy Temple, in order to hear the Holy Torah read in the Holy Temple, in the Holy City, in the Holy Land, that was all the men had to be there, all the women, all the children, they all had to know God Almighty's message. And also all of humanity was then affected and uplifted by that knowledge of God Almighty. And each one of those people came out super aware, supercharged to then spread that message of hope to every single human being. So we're now in a Shnas Hakel. We're in a year of this gathering, with the year of when people need to come together with joy, to increase in Torah mitzvah, Torah learning, both for the Jewish people and for the non-Jewish people, and the parts of the Torah that apply to them, and the doing of mitzvahs. Mitzvahs means connecting to God Almighty, doing the commandments that apply to each one of us, and to then be doing acts of loving kindness to help other people also to connect to God Almighty, improve their spiritual and their physical situation. So God willing, this is what we're in. We are right in the midst of all this incredibly powerful time, and our job is to approach this time with joy, to know that God Almighty is lovingly with us at every instant. He is inviting us to return to Him, meaning to turn towards Him, to become aware of Him, of His presence in every single of the trillion details of our life. At every moment, there's trillions of details of our life, and to know that God Almighty is with us. And through that, we will be able to have that experience of the knowing and the feeling of the God Almighty's love for every one of us, and to share that with every single person. So I want to bless you all with an incredible time of a Gemar Chasima Teva. Means you should all be brought to completion, the sealing of a good life for you and your family and your loved ones in the coming year, a year of abundance, a year of health, a year of abundance in health, a year of abundance in children and joy from your children and from your grandchildren and from your offspring, a year of abundance in material necessities and in material things that bring life to become something that is joyful, and bring life to something that is now able to expand and to help other people with the bounty that God Almighty blesses us with. So this is our time right now. Spread the message of hope. Make sure to subscribe to this channel. Make sure to also take the time to share this video. If you're watching the video, obviously you are watching the video. Some of you are watching it live, but those that are watching the video, take the time to get the link and share the link with at least one other person, to spread this message of hope, this clarity about what this time is about, and how the entire world is in the process of turning around to recognize God Almighty. And this is the most exciting times in the history of the world to be alive. And we merit to be alive right now and to have this opportunity to bring this great vision of God Almighty to completion for the benefit of every single human being, for the great and unlimited joy that God Almighty will feel in the fulfillment of His vision of bringing life into the world and continuing to bring life at every instant, and will feel that great joy eternally also. So God bless you all, and we will look forward to seeing you as this new year unfolds with better and better good news for everybody.